Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Capital Ideas, the podcast where we explore the forces shaping capital formation, entrepreneurship, and who ultimately gets to participate in building the future. I'm Nick Morgan, co-host of Capital Ideas and the founder of Investor Choice Advocates Network.
I'm Mark Hiraidi, co-host of Capital Ideas and Senior Legal Director and Policy Counsel at ICANN.
And I'm Dara Albright. I am a co-host of Capital Ideas and a very proud board member of ICANN. And today we are joined by John Tillman, a political strategist, policy leader, entrepreneur, and author of the new book, The Political Vice, where he lays out a framework for how power actually operates in America and how those dynamics are shaping political and economic outcomes. At the same time, John is also building something that is very innovative and exciting called the Hall of Giants. The Hall of Giants is a new immersive experience that will change how people understand entrepreneurship, innovation, and free enterprise. So with that, John, welcome to Capital Ideas.
Well, thanks for having me. And it's always fun to be on a show with the name Capital Ideas. And we're not talking about a federal capital or a state capital, but how we start businesses in capital formation. It's a nice change.
Right, there you go. So let's start off with a topic that's actually rooted in America's founding, and that's obviously entrepreneurism. You said that nearly everything in our daily lives exists because of an entrepreneur, that they built something that somebody else needed. Now, could you explain, talk a little bit about that and explain why fostering a culture of entrepreneurs and innovators is so critical to freedom and prosperity?
Well, people are going to go on their summer vacations. They're going to fly on a jet that wouldn't exist without the Wright brothers and entrepreneurs. You know, people think about the Wright brothers and the development of a powered flight, but they don't realize that they had a manufacturing company building airplanes very successfully for many years thereafter. And they'll drive around in their cars this summer. And of course, they'll consume either electrons, if it's an electric car, or if you go upstream from that, fossil fuel generated the electricity that charged those batteries, or they'll put gasoline in their cars and run the air conditioners that cool them when they drive across the plains at 80 degrees or 90 degrees. And we take these miracles of our daily life for granted. But when you strip it all away and go back upstream to the root source, every single physical thing that we have in our lives, every service that we consume exists because at some point an entrepreneur decided to start a business to do a singular thing that I think the world has lost sight of, which is serve other people well. Entrepreneurship, free enterprise, capitalism, these are permission-based systems. I try to persuade you I have a great product. I try to persuade you I can provide a service that will enhance your life, and you decide to give me money because on the margin, the value of what I'm offering you is better than the money that you have in your pocket. This is a permission-based system based on consent. Up until the founding of this country in 1776, all the previous systems were based on coercion and power and submission, and were not based on consent. Even the British, as liberal as the British were, relatively speaking, in the 1700s, and the common law that was developed, British common law that was developing, that was brought to the colonies in the 16 and 1700s. The bottom line is the king was still king, and he decided what your rights were. The founding of this country is the first truly great entrepreneurial act of the modern era, and it has launched the greatest episode of prosperity for all people, but most importantly for the poor and disadvantaged. And one of the reasons goes to the very essence of your organization, which is capital formation. What the founding of this country did, combined with free enterprise and entrepreneurship, is let poor people form the capital to start businesses, to create products that serve other people well. And it's a miracle.
Wow. I have chills from that.
Yeah. I bet you could make a whole lecture about a pencil and the.
Well, that's been done.
That's been done. That's been done.
It's been done, but I owned a sporting goods business and I used to sell weight equipment and I used to marvel. And I tell customers, you know, this is long before I was involved in public policy, but I was long involved in this subject matter. And I say, look at this 10-pound barbell. Think about this. I'm selling this 10-pound barbell to you for $5.50. It was 55 cents a pound back then. And it started out as gray iron in some tract of land somewhere, and somebody mined it and then, then smelted it and then put it into a form and then took it out and painted it and put it in a box and then put it on a ship, and it came to Long Beach, California on a truck, and I'm selling it to you for $5.50. That's a miracle. It's not a pencil, but it's still a miracle.
It's incredible. Yeah. Well, you put your finger on an issue that's near and dear to ICANN's heart, which is capital formation. So capital markets, really where the entrepreneurs and the investors meet and see if they can come to an agreement on an investment. If free enterprise is supposed to reward people who serve others well, the point you just made, that depends, I think, in part at least, on capital flowing to the best ideas. Do you think that's what's happening today, or are there forces distorting how capital gets allocated?
Oh, there are many, many forces distorting how capital gets disseminated to good purpose. And the idea, the ultimate goal, of course, is that capital should flow to the best ideas, but that's actually not true. Capital should flow where the person holding the capital thinks it's worthy.
Hmm.
It may or may not be a good idea to start a French restaurant in some place in, say, Fremont, Michigan, where I grew up, a town of 3,500 people. There's a lot of very sophisticated people there, but I doubt it could support a high-end French restaurant. But maybe somebody wants to try to do it because they have the money to do it. That's okay. But we do tend to solve our great problems in society when you have a free flow of capital to the problem solvers, the entrepreneurs who see problems that are causing trouble in society, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in the creature comforts of life, whether it's in safety, whatever it might be. Capital does tend to flow where the greatest problems are, the greatest frictions in our lives are. Think about, I had this funny conversation with a friend of mine who was putting in some new storm windows some years ago, and it was a very, very elegant design that allowed him to take in and out the storm windows for the summer and have the screens. And it was very simple to use and different. And he goes, I can't believe it took him till now to figure this out. And I said, well, that's because of capitalism. All the really smart engineers were working on bigger problems like how to make an automobile. And now the mid-level engineers are figuring out how to make your window better. That's the essence of free enterprise, is eventually we even solve the problem of your clunky storm windows. And this is why capital flow is so important, and why the government interfering with the flow of that capital is so detrimental to progress, human improvement, and the rising of the human spirit through improvements in our economic system.
Yeah, I think from a regulatory standpoint, given the current demographics, the aging population, there's an exposure of a certain class of assets, retail assets that hadn't been previously invested. And the SEC and regulators, I think, are struggling with how to provide investor protection in that environment. But we see that the rules that affect who can invest, who can raise capital, how risk is treated, they do constrain and shape not just the outcomes, but even determine who gets a chance to participate. Do you have a feeling for where government should play a role in shaping that activity?
I think their role should be diminished greatly for a host of reasons. For example, I forget what the number now for a qualified investor is. You guys would know it better than me what it is. Some years ago, it was like $250,000 of net worth, which today's world probably seems like chump change, but 20 years ago, that's what it was. Nevertheless, the point is when you put a benchmark on a floor on what someone's net worth can be to be a qualified investor to make decisions about these types of investments that we're talking about, you lock out all kinds of people who otherwise might be able to participate. It's anti-democracy in the little sense of the word. It's like anti-access. But meanwhile, ironically, you have aunts and uncles and grandpas and grandmas and moms and dads and brothers and sisters and friends down the street throwing $10,000, $5,000, $25,000, $50,000 into the pot for the kid down the street who's always been kind of clever and worked really hard. Now he's a coder at MIT or at the State College, and he's got an idea. And he's sold them all on that idea, and they've all calculated the risk. And the risk is based on really two things: how well he sells his idea and that he thinks there's a market for it, and their belief in him. And it's amazing how many success stories there are like that. Some of them become well known and famous, and others become successful, and some flame out and people lose their money. But the bottom line is, it is that process, so that fluidity, if you will, of capital formation that creates many startups that go on to great success. And risk, I think, is the most important part of this conversation, because this country was founded on risk. People came over in rickety boats to a land that was completely raw and undeveloped, ship after ship after ship of people going to be entrepreneurial before the word was invented to go carve out a new life in a new land. And the essence of America is that spirit of adventure and risk taking. And part of the problem in the 21st century is the regulators and the bureaucrats and the naysayers and the non-entrepreneurial folks. They want to mitigate risk. It's out of an abundance of caution. Well, sometimes we got to throw caution to the wind and forge ahead.
That's such a great point because that's true. They want to regulate the risk out of investment, but if you take the risk out of investment, you lose the upside. That's the whole point.
By
Right.
definition.
Right.
Yeah, and
There's only upside when there's risk.
to answer your question, John, the current wealth threshold for the accredited investor standard, which is what you're alluding to, is $1 million net worth.
It's a million.
And we should share with you the lawsuit we filed challenging that rule on behalf of a young investor named Emily, who very much would like to decide for herself how much risk she should undertake in her investment activity. So I think you've touched on some great points there.
Well, and think about the idiocy of that, because $1 million, what you're essentially saying is if you're a younger person who's in your 20s and getting started, you're locked out. You have no chance to invest in those kinds of investments because the odds on somebody who's in their 20s having a net worth of $1 million who didn't come from money or didn't hit the grand slam early on in their career is minimal. This goes to a point that I make that is a little esoteric, but given that you're into capital formation, I'll talk about it. Because the greatest inhibitor of capital formation is the progressive tax system. People don't realize how the progressive tax system actually hurts the poor most of all, because it makes it very hard for people who start out in their careers, who are poor by definition, usually in entry-level jobs. There's exceptions to that, obviously, but most people start out at some sort of moderate level of income. Then as you go up the income ladder, the government, of course, takes ever more of your money with the progressivity of the tax system, makes it harder to save and put money away in order to get the nest egg to start your first business. And I went back and looked when I started my first business and officially launched it publicly in 1993, but I started working on it in 1991. I was in my late 20s and the late 80s, and I was making really good money and living high on the hog. And then one day I decided this is really stupid. So I sold everything and moved into a basement apartment with a roommate, sold my fancy car. I got out of my fancy apartment, went in what I called the Cash is King program and cut my spending to $600 a month. And I saved about $250,000 in a little over 2 years because marginal rates were 28%. I went and looked how long it would take for me with today's rates to save that same amount of money inflation adjusted, and it would take me about 4.5 years. And that's why when you lower marginal rates, you see business growth rise faster, because people who are thinking of starting a business can see the light at the end of the tunnel to the sacrifice they have to make to save money. And that's why progressivity in the tax system actually does not create help for the poor and the middle class. It actually hurts and retards their ability to rise.
Mm. And you know what's so interesting about that too? You touch on the tax system, but we also have the educational system, we have a retirement system. All of our federal programs, if you think about it, they're all based on, on training people to have jobs and not be entrepreneurs. That's what they go to college to get jobs, or, the retirement system, it's based on if you have a job. So what I would be curious is, how do you see innovation now, or, even the climate changing? Like, are we going to stay on that path, or do you see us going back to an actual, going back to America's roots of allowing, citizens to the freedom to invest in and fund the innovation of its fellow citizen?
I think that the stories in the modern era, and part of the reason we're building the Hall of Giants, is that we want to really become a civic institution that popularizes these stories in a way that connects with young people. Our target audience will be families with children, because we really think it's essential to the 21st century destiny of America that the entrepreneurial spirit not only rises, but becomes respected and revered once again. It wasn't so long ago in this country that the Horatio Alger story was a common norm in our country to be respected, that entrepreneurs were respected no matter whether they were struggling in their basement whenever they were going to make their next payment, or whether they got to the penthouse and had the private jet. It used to be a universal, whether you're of the left or of the right, it used to be a universal American norm that free enterprise and capitalism were noble and worthy, and our founding was worthy, and entrepreneurs were worthy. And today we have division on that. And all the talks that I do, what I find most amazing is when I talk about free enterprise and capitalism as being noble and worthy, and that the entrepreneurs are the drivers of the system, the way I like to say it is they're the conductors of the prosperity train. All of this ride along with the greatness of entrepreneurs who create the things that make our lives better. There are some people who see that through an ideological slant. That is not an ideological slant. That is a humanist slant. From the beginning of time, people have been looking for ways to improve their life. And the system that was founded here in 1776 is the best system by far ever found before, for the reasons I cited before, which is it's a consent-based system, or persuasion consent-based system. So I'm very optimistic that we're going to see a rebirth of entrepreneurialism. We're seeing a lot of the coverage of the American 250 celebration. There's a lot of talk about entrepreneurs. We're obviously very involved in that. We are in the Alamo today as part of the America 250 tour with our giant tent talking about the entrepreneurial spirit of America. And we have a Ben Franklin hologram. Ben Franklin was a great founding entrepreneur. And I think we're going to see more of that. And I also think that there's a battle right now between trying to sell people on ever more government dependency versus ever more independence by controlling your own destiny. And there's a real conflict going on for younger people between sort of the gig economy. I want to control my life and my schedule. I don't want to become an automaton and part of the managerial class on the one hand. On the other hand, entrepreneurs are rapacious capitalists and all the rest of that. That's in conflict. And I think about when people look at how they actually live their lives, they're going to choose control of their own destiny more so than giving up that control.
It seems that giving them more control over their own destiny has the potential to benefit them. I guess people could make poor decisions and not benefit from that, which leads me to ask, I think it's a common perception, disagreed with by many, that markets reward merit. Do you think that's true? And if so, do you think there are reasons to believe that markets rewarding merit force is being weakened in ways?
That's a great question. I have not been asked that question before. I don't know that I think markets reward merit. I think sometimes they reward merit, but I don't think it's axiomatic that markets reward merit. I think markets reward perceived value. Value is really about value. And this is one of the things that Marx didn't understand and the socialists don't understand, is that, especially when it comes to labor versus capital, people think the labor inputs create value. No, it creates some value, but it's the customer that ultimately decides what value is. I was looking at I have a home in Naples and one in Chicago, and I have long fantasized about having a home in a mountain town where I could ski easily. And so I've been looking at some of that. And every time I look at it, I go, the value proposition just doesn't work for me. I mean, I don't want to pay $4 million for a 2-bedroom condo in Park City, but there are people paying $4 million for a 2-bedroom condo in Park City. It's a value proposition. Could I stretch and make that work? Probably, but to me, it doesn't make any sense. To other people, it's like, no problem, I'll write the check right now. So it's all about value. I think that, and this is why it's all about persuasion. You have to persuade people that on the margin, you're offering them value for the money that you're asking. It's very much like owning a business. I had a friend who had a business some years ago. They'd worked very hard in that business for many years, a very custom boutique software business that was very profitable. And they were convinced it was worth a lot of money, but they weren't getting any buyers, and he didn't understand it. And I kept saying, well, you have an inflated sense of the value of your business because you spent 20 years building it. You wrote the code, you updated the code, and you have all these relationships with these customers. When buyers look at your business, they see it as a cult of your personality and your relationships. So they don't see the value that is transferable from you to them. And that's why you're not getting the money you want. And I think that's what it's really about more than merit.
Before we started, we were talking about your own personal experience in starting and owning and running a small business. What do you think policymakers can do to make the markets more friendly to entrepreneurs? If you could remove one major barrier limiting participation in markets today, what would that be?
I would I'm not an expert in this area, but I would make it much easier for people to do low dollar crowdfunding and sharing of risk. So let's say that you have a particular passion for restaurants. You're a foodie. My wife is a foodie. It would be fun to have a fund you could go put some money into. And have you heard of Angel Studios? Angel Studios is doing sort of a version of this. And actually, they're having some controversy because of the movie that just came out, Animal Farm, but they have this guild, which is their members. And these members, I forget how they join. I think they might put some money in the pot, a modest amount of money in the pot, and they sort of vote on what goes to production and what films they make. I think it'd be really great if you could have a sort of a crowdsource way to fund small businesses. And it could be any category. You could have different categories. You could say you can put in $10, you can put $1,000, $10,000, and then you could have different categories of risk, and everybody can participate and make bets. But that's very difficult to do, as I understand it now, regulatorily. That is really a problem because the government wants to protect all of this Neanderthal dumb people out here from our own desires, which of course we don't need them to do. most of us are smart enough to make a good risk decision. And transparency is the best antidote to understanding risk, of course. I think that's important.
Yeah.
That's my off the cuff answer for that one, Mark.
That's a good, that your intuition is very good, because I think the SEC has been struggling with trying to do exactly that. And as you mentioned, there are a number of barriers that hopefully will get eliminated with the current Congress.
I think one of the ways to pursue this is pick any IPO. Bill Ackman just had his IPO. There's other IPOs coming soon. I think, Musk is going to have a gigantic IPO. All the insiders, all the already wealthy will have access to those IPOs. And all the people that are locked out of those IPOs are working class people and poor people who might have $1,000 or $10,000 or $50,000 that they could put in, but I don't think the regulators would let them actually do it, even if there was a mechanism by which to do it. Think about how amazing, freeing that would be to let average people it might have to be a lottery, because I think there would be a huge interest in this. And think about how it would educate people on how these things work. You'd really get a much broader education about the idea of the investor class and what the investor class actually is. Everybody understands that the guy that owns a sporting goods store in their hometown, or the flooring store or whatever it might be, or the guy running the garage that's repairing your car, everybody understands he's the investor class, right? People get that, but it starts to get a little muddy when you have millions of investors and shareholders and funds and all the rest of it the way it works now. But the more people understand how the system works, the better off we all are. And I think democratizing it in that way and open up access to it would be really an interesting idea.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's interesting, to your point, I think that as we kind of move more towards that crowdfunding mindset, there's also an opportunity to mitigate risk just through the structure of the deal itself. So you use the example of, a local restaurant, for example, so someone could go and they could get, maybe it's a rev share. It doesn't have to be equity. It could be, it could be some sort of debt, or, it could be equity with other perks that are involved in it. Maybe it's a hamburger named after you, a vanity play, or maybe it's, discounts for meals when you take your family. So there's a lot of ways that we could, really inspire more community investing in entrepreneurism just through that.
Dara, you're starting to sound like Kevin O'Leary from Shark Tank. He always wants those rev share deals. He wants a piece of every unit sold. That's his brand, right?
Well, why don't you talk a little bit more about Hall of Giants, and just because I just love this intersection of entertainment and education, and I think that that's the key to getting the youth. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how you're doing that.
Well, we're going to build a campus, and the analog for this is the way modern sports franchise ownership happens. So the best example these days is what's happening right now in Kansas City with the Royals, and and Hallmark are partnering to build a large campus. Battery Park in Atlanta is a really good example of what I'm talking about. What the Ricketts family has done with the Cubs in Chicago is a very good example. In what was an established area, sometimes you have greenfield and other times you have an established stadium situation. But the idea in modern sports franchise ownership is that the franchise itself is an anchor tenant, and then you build multi-use development all around it. And the goal of that, and why owners have moved to this model, is because they want to control the economics around their anchor tenant, their sports team in that case. The sports team has to share revenue with the league, but all the economic development that goes on around it accrues to their benefit. And of course, then they have to serve their customers in that multi-use development. So we're going to build a campus with a Hall of Giants as the anchor tenant, if you will. So I'll talk about that for a moment, then come back to the larger vision. And it will be, the way I like to talk about it, Dara, is it's a little bit Hollywood filmmaking meets Rock and Roll Hall of Fame meets Disney World. And those are three great storytelling environments and entertainment environments. Film is the ultimate storytelling media, and song is right behind it. Some of the greatest stories ever told have been told through song. And we want to tell stories. We want to humanize and personalize and dramatize the lives of the great entrepreneurs of America, both known and unknown, both famous and unfamous, both successful and also the failures. We want to tell their stories in a way that connects with people and how they live their everyday life. So we don't want to just talk about the abstract. We want to talk about the fact that the next time, maybe we'll talk about this over Memorial Day weekend when everybody's pulling the barbecue out and they're going to start putting their charcoal briquettes on the barbecue. one of the hidden stories, Lightford Charcoal, which is the #1 brand in the country, was actually started by Henry Ford using the scraps from his milling operation for the wood that he used in making Model Ts. And he had Thomas Edison design the factory that created these charcoal briquettes, and it was called Ford Charcoal. And it helped really build the whole idea of barbecuing in the backyard. And eventually, when Ford died, they sold it and it became Lightford, which was named after his cousin. These are little stories and vignettes that really make the idea of that entrepreneur. Everybody knows about Henry Ford, but who knows he was involved in charcoal briquettes, right? No one knows that. And we all use it every summer or every year round, in my case. So we want to make it really entertaining. One of the things we've hired a firm, a really well-known design firm called RWS Global, that designs these types of immersive amusement park-like rides. And we have a rendering that is really awesome. And now we're pitching that as part of our seeking consent to fund this operation. But one of the rides, for example, is a time traveling machine where you board a buckboard wagon in 1776 and you travel through time, and you get off that buckboard wagon and you end up in a stagecoach, and then a locomotive, a steamship, an automobile, a jet airplane, and you end up landing on Mars in a rocket ship. And throughout that journey, you're going to be taught, exposed to all the entrepreneurs who created those businesses that shrunk time and space and made our modern life what it is, and the journey that happened. And we're going to approach that kind of time traveling meme, if you will, throughout a lot of what we do. So we're going to travel through time in terms of how the household and your life in the house has changed. What kerosene, most people think of Rockefeller in terms of the automobile and the combustion engine. What most people have lost sight of is Rockefeller became the richest man because of kerosene and the lighting of American homes. Up until kerosene was widely available and inexpensive, because Rockefeller was such a great entrepreneur, most people, their days ended when it got dark, because lighting at night was very expensive and not very good. Wax candles were very hard to keep lit, didn't put off much lumen power, and were expensive. And whale oil, of course, was terrible for the whales. They paid a big price. And kerosene completely illuminated homes in a way that had never been done before. And then, of course, electricity came after that. But those are the kind of stories that we're going to tell, and how it made our lives better and how it improved the quality of our life. The irony of that is a middle-class person, even a poor person today in America, lives a better quality of life materially than Rockefeller himself.
Have you picked a city, John?
We've hired a firm that's done some site analysis for us of Miami, Orlando, Atlanta, Nashville, and Dallas-Fort Worth. And they all appear to be great prospects. There's differences with each of them. We are leaning towards Florida because we do want to have a year-round outdoor venue if possible. With the right investor donor interest, we would consider going to Nashville, I think. But right now, I'd say Orlando is our leading candidate, and Miami's right behind. And Atlanta's probably right in that mix too.
Very cool. I look forward to seeing that develop. I especially want to go to the Hall of Giants gift shop. We are constantly looking for good swag for ICANN, and I'm sure you'll have some fantastic
We have
stuff.
some fantastic ideas for the gift shop, and we're very excited about the gift shop. I'm an old retailer. I'm going to spend a lot of time on the gift shop. I want to sell some merch.
Good. We want to buy some. Well, let's pivot for a minute. I don't know if I get my camera to, yeah.
Oh, there we go. Look at
Your book. Oh, well, the camera's not picking it up, but
You got a little bit of it.
you got a little bit of it, but it's The Political Vice, and I really enjoyed it. And not to oversimplify things, people should go get a copy and read it. But you do talk a lot about the way the media and public pressure can shape outcomes for certain things. And of course, here at ICANN, we're focused on the capital markets. Do you have any ideas about how the forces you talk about in your book shape and influence the way people think about capital markets in particular?
Yeah. So, for example, the basic premise of the book is that politics is a pressurized system, and he who has the ability to apply pressure to political decision makers has power. That's how you get power. And power really, and political actors are motivated by three things: political expediency, which is deal making. I'll vote for your bridge if you vote for my highway, those kind of things. I'll vote for your social program if you vote for my social program. Deal making, that's about 65% of all the votes. And about 30-ish% of the votes are fear focused. The bad things will happen if I vote this way or that way. And fear is a big driver of what happens in politics. And then principle comes up about 5% of the time. This is based on my 20-year survey of elected officials. So the whole idea is that media pressure, public opinion pressure, and elite influencer pressure are the three sides of the vice, and they're squeezing the people in the vice, and the output on the fourth side is dependent on who's doing the squeezing. So when it comes to capital markets, part of the problem is that the anti-capitalist have great influence and are creating pressure on the regulators who are, even though they're not elected officials, regulators are political actors and operate inside the vice, as do obviously elected officials from Congress and the executive branch. But the anti-capitalist, anti-free market really want government control of the system. Those people have great sway over everyone because they are applying pressure constantly. And part of the problem is they're communicating with the public about capitalism and free markets being unfair and cruel, taking advantage. There was an article in the New York Times this week about micro looting, or a podcast they had, and then they published it. I don't know if you saw that, about sort of excusing micro looting because corporations are stealing from their workers and customers all the time. Of course, this is not true. There's always bad behavior in corporate America, in government, in medicine, in law. There's bad behavior everywhere. But the place where you get the greatest accountability is actually the private sector, in business, where bad behavior tends to be rooted out very, very quickly. So the problem is that you have a lot of people applying pressure to political actors to create ever more regulations because they want to control the system and they want to harvest the money from the system. And that is part of the problem we face. That's part of the problem capital markets face. Regulators going to regulate, man.
Well, one of the pressures we see is a topic we talked about earlier, is risk. That oftentimes we see the idea of protection of investors through prohibition. These are risky investments you're about to make in your friend's French restaurant that might go under, and so we're going to make it prohibitive for you to get involved because it's risky, and then that we do see those kinds of pressures being applied to the regulators and the legislators on outcomes for capital markets.
We need to return to a norm in America where we're the country that embraces risk. We're not reckless, we're not imprudent, but we embrace risk. America has been a risk-taking country from its founding. It built a continental nation through risk-taking, had a lot of problems through that process, which we're not going to litigate here. It wasn't a perfect, it was what it was at the times it was, but nevertheless, it was risk-taking. And this nation needs to return to a comfort with risk-taking and an understanding that with risk, there's upside and downside. And when you make good choices with good competence, on the whole, those upsides far outweigh the downsides. And that is obviously true. And unfortunately, the nanny state folks want to strip risk out of all these decisions, which then what they don't understand is that when you start to strip out risk, you're creating risk. Because when you take risk out of the scenario, you're introducing an unseen risk that you can't anticipate, which in simple words would be economic decline and a loss of economic opportunity that you can't tell what it would have been, but there are some lives that would have been saved because of some innovation in medicine or in manufacturing or whatever it might have been.
Yep. Lack of diversity in terms of investment options. It's another risk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the areas, of course, in the last 10 years where the regulators have, because of a lack of clarity in regulations, increased risk to entrepreneurs in cryptocurrencies. And we seem to be on the verge of some reform, some clarity. In fact, the bill that Congress is considering now, which may be on the verge of enactment, is the Clarity Act, to define more clearly what the rules are relating to cryptocurrency and the regulator's jurisdiction. In the next 10, assuming that passes and assuming that we have some clarity on cryptocurrencies, people are anticipating that all sorts of assets are going to be tokenized, that retail investors, young people will be able to participate in various investment classes, asset classes, through tokenization and fractionalization that it brings. Who knows in the next 10 years what will be on our kids' phones and the ability to trade instantaneously. What do you think? Do you have a vision for where we're going to be in 10 years?
In terms of crypto or more broadly?
No, more broadly. I cite crypto as an example, but more broadly in 10 years, where would you like it to see us be?
Well, I think part of the challenge is the regulators are always a little behind where the technology and the desires are. So they're always playing a little bit of catch up. And so I think the genie's out of the bottle in terms of crypto and this desire for fluid trade between people, peer to peer, whatever you want to call it. So I think that's already happening, and I think it's going to be very difficult for them to slow that down. I am not a crypto expert. This is a really good example of risk, right? So I could be in crypto. A lot of my friends are in crypto. I'm not in crypto because I just don't understand it. So for me, even though they have assessed the risk and some of them done extremely well, and I kind of look longingly like, gosh, I wish I understood how to do that, because some of them have made boatloads of money and bought boats. I mean, it's really ridiculous. For me, I'm not comfortable with that. I'm doing things that they would never do, that they don't understand, right? That's part of how risk works, and that's how the diversity of people coming into any given market happens. But I do think that the desire, the generation that's coming of age now, particularly the ones that are, say, coming into adulthood now, and even more so than the ones that are in their 30s now, they are so comfortable with the digital world that the idea that we ever had any kind of tangible monetary tools. Now, I'm very much against digital currency where it's going to be mandated. I think that because, look what happened to the truckers in Canada. It's very worrisome when the government can cancel your digital currency. This is part of what worries me. I love the idea of an alternative currency. I'm hoping that we actually return to the mean. Most people don't realize that most currency in the 1800s, for most of the 1800s, was private, and it wasn't government issued currency. There was privately backed currency, and you took risk when you took that banknote from that bank in Boston when you were in St. Louis, or you took it from the St. Louis bank when you were out in Laramie, Wyoming. And everybody made decisions based on their best knowledge of those banknotes. And I think I think crypto is a version of that. And I think it's actually returning to the mean, where people want to have a self-regulating ability to exchange value without the government interfering with it. So I'm not sure I totally understand what the proper role of the government is in this, but I always think less is more when it comes to that question.
Maybe that's a good place to leave it, John. This has been a very insightful conversation and wide-ranging, more wide-ranging than I anticipated. But you've really touched on ways that a lot of these topics are interconnected. We want to thank you so much for joining us and wish you well on the work you're doing. Hope all goes well with the book and the Hall of Giants, and that people will take away from both of those efforts a deeper understanding of entrepreneurship and free enterprise. As for our listeners, you can hear more about ICANN or learn more about ICANN at icanlaw.org, and we'll see you on the next Capital Ideas. Thank you.